think it's time to begin. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another event as part of our college-wide lecture series on race, violence, and health. My name is Phil Brick, professor of politics, and with me is Dr. Emily Jones, assistant professor of German Studies and Environmental Humanities. It's our pleasure to welcome the Environment at Princeton University to deliver a presentation, Slow Violence in Our Political Moment. It's fitting that Professor Nixon addresses us today, Indigenous Peoples Day, as much of his work has involved the study of struggles of Indigenous peoples and environmental struggles of the poor and marginalized in the Global South. A bit more on his work in a moment. But this day and every day, it's appropriate to acknowledge that the land that we live, teach, and learn on in Walla Walla is part of the traditional homelands of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse peoples, seated during the Walla Walla Treaty Council of 1855. We recognize the continued presence and sovereignty of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation on the reserve lands near us in Pendleton, Oregon, or near Pendleton, Oregon, and throughout the surrounding area, and acknowledge their stewardship of this land as we work alongside them today. Mr. Nixon is best known for his award-winning book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, which inspires his presentation today about how this concept can help us understand and activate our best instincts in this fraught political moment. Today, he'll lead us through several aspects of our times, including climate change, fracking, the Black Lives Matter movement, COVID-19, showing how the concept of slow violence can help us put a finger on the violence of our times, the first victims of which are invariably the marginalized and the voiceless. Mr. Nixon will offer a presentation for about 30 minutes, which will be followed by comments and guided discussion with Emily and I. The audience is also invited to use the chat function to submit questions, and we hope to get to as many of these we can as time allows. And please be aware that this event is being recorded. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Rob Nixon. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phil, and for your generous introduction and for the invitation, and to Emily as well for agreeing to respond today. So I'm delighted to be here and not to be there, but thank you for your presence, everybody who's attending today. So in my book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, I define slow violence as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. A violence of delayed effects, delayed destruction that is dispersed across time, and an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. So in this category, I would include such phenomena as climate change, thawing glaciers, toxic drift, the radioactive aftermaths of wars, oil spills, acidifying oceans, and a host of related environmental crises. So I want to, in the book, my focus is very much on literary witnessing, on the ways writers have tried to witness this elusive form of violence. And today I thought I'd give my talk a different focus, which is on visual representation, the way that artists and activists have tried to render or respond to the challenge of slow violence by rendering it in visual form. And this first image is Isaac Cordell's Follow the Leaders. It speaks for itself, but it's indicative of the involuted conversations of elderly leaders in the face of rising waters. So I want to start with a quote. Every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be inhabitable. Those words are both chilling and sort of familiar, as many of us wrestle with this quandary. What's unusual is that those words were uttered 60 years ago by President Kennedy in an address to the UN. And the planetary threat that he was warning of was not climate chaos, which was barely a blip on anybody's radar back then, but the atom bomb. The nuclear threat had an explosive urgency and visual clarity to it that was at the center of the Cold War. And we think of the mushroom cloud, the immediate, explosive, spectacular violence of the bomb. We can contrast that with the preeminent threat of the 21st century. If the preeminent threat of the second half of the 20th century was nuclear Armageddon, in the 21st century, that has shifted very much towards climate breakdown. So that if we look at a process like glacial melt, glacial retreat, it has nothing like the apocalyptic colors or image or explosive visibility and the cinematic potential, if you like, of the nuclear mushroom cloud. The Norwegian writer André Mageson says, "A dying glacier is no more dramatic than the normal changes of the spring season. A dying glacier disappears quietly." And so this is very much in line with what I'm thinking of in terms of slow violence, is that the fate of the glaciers is absolutely critical to the fate of life on Earth. Indeed, 40% of the world's population depends for its drinking water on glacial and snowpack melt from the Himalayas. And we know the impact that melting glaciers have incrementally over sea level rise. But I think you can sense there the contrast in the challenge of making a threat visible. It's so much easier in a certain way to make the nuclear threat visible in a concrete image. So let me take another pair of images. This is from the Deep Horizon oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. When the rig exploded, 11 men died in the blast. This is, as you can see from this photograph, a pyrotechnic event. And that was followed by the spraying of Corexit on the Gulf of Mexico. And so what you see in the top left corner, that sort of mauve maroon area, is where Corexit has mingled with the oil. And Corexit, which was a highly toxic substance that's banned in Europe, was sprayed very widely over the Gulf of Mexico. And what it didn't really do was disperse the oil. What it did was it suspended the oil beneath the surface. And people have argued quite convincingly that photography was going to play a large role in the claims for damages against BP. And the less visible the oil was, the better the company was protected against those damages. So here what you see is the long-term emergency of the toxicity that the Corexit introduced to the Gulf versus the instantaneous and easily recognizable trauma of the explosion of the rig, okay? So here we can see an artist trying to render BP's impact on the Gulf ecosystem and the human health of the inhabitants of that area, trying to render it in a condensed dramatic form. And so what the artist has done is taken one of the most famous war photographs of all time by Eddie Adams of a Vietnamese general executing at point blank range a Viet Cong captive during that war. And so here you can see the artist trying to concentrate a dispersed set of lethal effects into a single image that is correlative to the idea of execution. So if we move to fracking, many of you may have seen Josh Fox's celebrated anti-fracking film called Gasland. And I wanted to think about a little bit against the backdrop of what George Monbiot calls the bonfire of regulation. So under neoliberal capitalism, regulations are the enemy And we can just see the sort of consummation of that under the present administration, the rolling back of wave after wave after wave of environmental and public health regulations. Okay, so what Josh Fox was trying to do in Gasland was trying to pinpoint the dispersed and in many ways elusive threats posed by fracking to water supplies in particular, to the stability of land, because fracking can cause earthquakes and so forth. And what he came up with was the flame in the faucet. And he went around from one state to another, from Wyoming to Pennsylvania to Texas, and beyond to Montana and Pennsylvania. And he had people who lived in the vicinity of fracking take a cigarette lighter to the faucet. And so these images of flammable tap water became the ethical and artistic core of the film. So again and again, you have these quotidian scenes of somebody in their kitchen or their bathroom, turning on the faucet, taking the cigarette lighter out, and the water bursting into flames. Okay, so this idea of getting slow violence to flare into instant visibility, I think, is at the heart of what Josh Fox was doing in that film. Then I wanted to move on to slow violence and the Anthropocene. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Anthropocene. It's a paradigm that was coined in 2000 by an ecologist and an atmospheric chemist. And they argued that the collective impacts of Homo sapiens on Earth's life systems were the equivalent of an asteroid strike. So the relatively stable environment that we've inhabited of the Holocene, the environment in which all human civilizations evolved, has been sufficiently destabilized, they argued, that we have been catapulted into a new epoch, which they called the Anthropocene. And the argument is that not for 2.5 billion years, basically, when cyanobacteria oxygenated the Earth, has any living species had such an impact on Earth's life systems, on the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, biodiversity, and so forth, okay? So I wanted to think about the Anthropocene a little bit in the context of a series of underwater sculptures by the sculptor and photographer Jason DeCaris Taylor. And so what interested me here is his attempt to condense environmental time in a kind of premonitory way, okay? And so what you have here is the Volkswagen Beetle and the figure on the windshield. And it's hard to tell exactly what that figure indicates. Is this an accident? Is the figure sleeping? Is the figure mummified? But there's a sense that of looking at this from the perspective of a post-carbon age, okay, looking back at the present that we are creating from a future vantage point. There's another image of it. So one reading of that could be the figure's asleep through the carbon catastrophe. Is the figure mourning the fallout of the carbon era? Okay, is it a kind of a fetal sleep, or is this person a kind of casualty of a slow motion collision? What it reminded me of is the atrophied figures from Pompeii, where famously during the volcanic eruption, people were frozen in whatever postures they were at the time, so that they could be sleeping or cooking or walking. And I think that what we have with Jason DeCaris Taylor's Anthropocene series is this idea of arrested time. again, rendering in one compressed image the fallout of uncontrollable carbon consumption. So here we go with the longer vision of the same set of sculptures. And I'm very interested in the use of the figures on the surface who are scuba divers, but they look sort of otherworldly. They're sort of almost angelic, looking down and looking back, so that the physical distance under the ocean is a surrogate for the temporal distance between the future and the end of the carbon age. And they sort of remind me, for those of you who know Walter Benjamin, of Walter Benjamin's idea of the angel of progress being blown back into the future as the ruins of the present unfold. Okay. Now, another attempt to instill political and ethical action in the present by imagining the future vantage point was instigated by the former president of the Maldives Islands in the Indian Ocean, Mohammed Nasheed. And so in 2015, there was a coalition of endangered small islands, low-lying islands, that was put together, and Mohammed Nasheed was at the head of this. And the highest point in the Maldives is 7 foot. Okay, that's the peak. So they're very, very vulnerable, first of all, to salination and then to disappearance. And what he was projecting was, if we do not act on climate change, that by 2050, there was a strong possibility that the Maldives would have disappeared. And so what he did was, in collaboration with Bill McKibben and 350.org, he made a video that went viral of holding a cabinet meeting underwater. So this is the Maldives in 2050, the cabinet meeting. And so it has a kind of a Gothic humor of the absurd, but also it was a very effective way, through a kind of performance theater, of dramatizing the fact that for a poor island nation, low-lying island nation like the Maldives, this is a slow-moving disaster that ultimately, if left unchecked, will inundate and destroy them. So what about slow violence in the air? Okay, we've been focusing on sort of watery disappearances, but water and air are our two most fundamental immediate needs, and both connect to the unfoldings of slow violence. If water is one flashpoint for slow violence, then another is air. And I want to start with an image from Chai Zheng's documentary Under the Dome, which went viral in China in 2015 and had something like 150 million views in 3 days before the Chinese censors banned it. And this was at a time when there was something like 55,000 environmental protests per year in China, okay? So a number of artists and activists took up the cause of air pollution in China. And so it's good to remember this is all pre-COVID, when masks were extremely unusual. And so here we have a pre-COVID theater of a marriage ceremony of this couple saying "I do" in sickness and in health. And so what you have here is the idea of a cross between a wedding and a fundamental struggle to breathe. And in this way, the air pollution is a bridge issue between incremental slow violence and an immediate crisis of the lack of breath. We breathe 25,000 times a day, and to have that breath interrupted for any amount of time constitutes a physiological crisis. Okay, So I think one of the things that you see with the way that artists and activists have responded to the question of breath is that it bridges the slow violence and the immediate violence. Here's another bit of performance theatre, again, reminding you that this is pre-COVID and before Black Lives Matter, for that matter of fact. And the mouth is the avenue of breath and also of speech. And so here what the activists were protesting was both the poor air quality and censorship, the censorship of social and environmental protests. So the idea of muzzled speech, of having no breathing room, as well as insufficient or compromised breath because of the air pollution. So this question of the link between slow violence and abrupt violence through the aperture of the mouth and the lungs, and of course has taken hold very, very dramatically through the Black Lives Matter movement. And through that movement, there has been this focus on the link between physical suffocation and structural suffocation, or systemic suffocation, if you like. And the movement first really took off. The term had been coined before, but the movement really took off in 2014 with the chokehold murder of Eric Garner by police in Staten Island. Now, before he died, Eric Garner uttered the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times. And his final words became immortalized and taken up as a slogan, and ultimately becoming one of the most powerful memes of our times. So if we think about the murder of Eric Garner, he was brutally suffocated, but there's also a backstory. He suffered from, Eric Garner had grown up in Staten Island, and he suffered from extreme asthma. Now, Staten Island is the most polluted and industrialized of the New York city boroughs. So his lungs were weakened by the slow violence of air pollution in Staten Island to a degree that wouldn't have occurred, say, in Manhattan. And so that his murder, his vulnerability, was a result both of the slow processes of violence through zoning and racist infrastructure distribution and industrial vulnerability to industrial pollutants, and also the direct violence, the racialized violence of the police chokehold. Okay. And I would say that there are a number of writers, Julie Zay is one, and Kimberly Bain is another, who have written very powerfully about this trope of I can't breathe. Okay, so in the current moment, obviously the Black Lives Matter that grew out of Eric Garner's murder was pre-COVID. And now we have a resuscitation, if you like, of that movement during the COVID era. And the coincidence of these protests, these Black Lives Matter protests, with the rise of COVID, okay? And so in this context, the mask has a triple function to filter, protect against COVID, also can conceal identity, and again, represent muzzled speech, the lack of access to freedom of speech. And you know, again, artists have picked up on on Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free," which is a reminder that breathing is a very powerful dead metaphor. If we talk about not having enough breathing room or being able to breathe free, or somebody using all the oxygen in the room. We don't normally think of those as metaphors, but what has happened with the Black Lives Matter movement is they have brought a dead metaphor back to life. So that breathing is this very, very loaded word that carries so many layers to it in relation to inequality and racism and violence. So I wanted to close by just saying a few things about slow resistance. If we think of something like the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, which I wrote about in my book, led by Wangari Maathai, who went on to get the Nobel Peace Prize, they ended up planting something like 100 million trees. And the benefits of those trees are very slow to materialize. No politician is going to reap the benefits of those trees within their 4-year electoral span. But to plant a tree is to give shade, to offer shade to unborn strangers. It's an investment in the long future. And we know very much about indigenous cosmologies in particular are very alive to the intergenerational perspective of sustaining hope through stewarding ecosystems that we depend on. So I Can't Breathe became We Can't Breathe. It became a collective rallying cry. And these two cries also dispersed around the world, particularly in large megacities like Cape Town, Lagos, Cairo, Jakarta, Delhi. The slogan, London, appeared again and again. And this was an interesting image that a friend of mine took on a highway just outside of Cape Town in South Africa, where somebody had put up this mural. And the wall on the left, as in many megacities today, was a wall separating privilege from poverty. And there's a road that goes, a highway that goes from the airport to the downtown city. And along this highway, there are informal settlements. And this wall was put up to segregate, basically, those settlements from the highway and to render the unsightly, supposedly unsightly shantytown invisible for tourists coming into the city, okay? Now, close to this place, so you have the pollution from the heavy traffic on the motorway, on the highway. There's also just half a mile away a coal-fired plant, so that the people in the shantytown are disproportionately exposed to particulates, okay? And you can see why, and they're also subject, as most poor communities are in this world, to excessive policing. And so you can see why this trope from that began in the US would resonate in a place like this community. And it becomes what the anthropologist Anthropocene calls a traveling allegory, a circulating image or circulating phrase that assumes a resonance across very different cultures. So I was made aware of this when I was on the west coast of Ireland, traveling around there, and there was a big fight about gas leaking from drilling by Shell Oil Company. And Shell, I'd been working on the terrible pollution record of Shell in Nigeria. And in 1995, the activist and writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, that's an image of him here, Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed by the Nigerian government for leading the protests against Shell's pollution. And the leakage and pollution was so bad that every year for 30 years, they had the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez in the Niger Delta. And so I'd been thinking a lot about Ken Saro-Wiwa and this struggle to dramatize and mobilize people around the slow violence of oil leakages and oil flaring. And I was astonished to come across this local fishing village in Rossclare on the west coast of Ireland, where the people had linked forces with the activists in the Niger Delta, and they put up this mural of Ken Saro-Wiwa and translated one of his poems from Agoni into Gaelic. And the names at the top are the other 8 activists who were executed with him. So I was very, very moved actually by the sense of common struggle by these 2 communities, these 2 estuary communities that were facing the slow violence of gas flaring and oil pollution. A few years ago, the Bolivian government decided to build a road through the low-lying Amazon region of the country, and exposing indigenous people to the colonists and settlers, and deforestation and new diseases and biodiversity loss. And there were enormous protests against that, but nothing seemed to be swaying the government. And so what the indigenous people in that area did was they decided to walk to La Paz, the capital. It was a distance of about 400 miles and an ascent of something like 14,000 feet. The capital is very, very high, and they were in the low-lying Amazon. So they had musicians, they had people join them as they marched. And so indigenous people and allies joined the march over this period of 3 months, until there was this enormous number of people who rallied in the central square of La Paz and in the plaza, and got the plan to build the road, which would have been so destructive to the indigenous sovereignty, got that plan reversed. So this was an example of a slow-moving protest that became cumulative, and in a sense offered a counter to the slow violence that the road would have brought. So clearly, climate change is one of the most dramatic instances of this kind of slow violence. But there's also a carryover, I think, or a partial parallel between COVID and climate change. And this image and this quote really caught my eye when I saw it first. It says, "We are all in the same storm. We are not all in the same boat." So what this was referring to was a planetary crisis which is faced unequally by people according to their subject position, according to their privilege. And the quote comes from a report by the British Mental Health Foundation on people's variable experiences of and exposure to COVID. And so obviously the cruise ship, which is associated with early outbreaks of COVID, and the different scales of vessels, the different protections. But this phrase and this image might be equally applicable to climate breakdown. We're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I think part of the challenge that these artists are trying to rise to is trying to speak to a global need while flagging the fact that these global crises are experienced from positions of unequal vulnerability. So I want to close with an image by the muralist Sam 3, called Deep Rooted. And I think it's a very powerful image because in my mind, it gives us a cross-section of environmental time that is simultaneously biological, social, and geological. We talked earlier about the Anthropocene and the stratification, the layers of fossils that we're creating through our current consumer practices. So the idea that the Anthropocene is a kind of a deep time into the future. And here what you have is an attempt by an artist to make visible the living body of environmental time, and to show how casual surface acts, in this case, an act of deforestation or tree felling, how that surface act has ripple effects in deep time. And of course, here we have the connection between the tree as the head and the torso as the human body, that we're not segregated from our impacts on the environment. And in the most literal sense, the felling of the tree is a kind of self-decapitation, a mindless act of humanity against itself. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Rob. There we go. I welcome the audience to use the chat function if you like to submit any comments and questions, but it was Rob's suggestion that we have kind of a guided discussion, and I was pleased to invite Emily to join us for that. Emily, if you'd like to start, that'd be great, or otherwise I can start. How do you want to do it?
I can jump in if you'd like. I've got thoughts. I usually do. Thank you, Rob, for this fantastic presentation. I love always to see someone who has such cred in dealing with literary sources and writing, also sort of dipping a toe into the visual arts. So I really appreciated your reading of those images. This is going a little bit into my own territory, but hopefully I can bring it back and give you a chance to respond. I see a number of students from one of my classes on writing environmental disaster, where we spend a lot of time talking about Barbie Zellizer's idea of the about to die image. And she describes it as this kind of mode of journalistic photography that depicts disasters as the thing that's about to happen. It's an inevitability that doesn't picture actual death, but sort of leads the viewer to fill in the blanks. That seems to be something that doesn't suit itself well to depicting the climate crisis and climate chaos. And I think that you brought in some really interesting examples of images that attempt to do that. And it gives rise to a kind of curious temporality, I think, which you pointed to throughout your talk. A sort of deep time reaching into the future, I think, is a really interesting concept, because I think a lot of times we think of deep time as reaching far into the past, but the idea of projecting that into the future is a really interesting one. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more, if you have other thoughts about this idea of slow resistance to what really are immediate crises. You know, I really appreciate, and I agree with you, that the cumulative effect of these kinds of actions is so important. But I wonder what you might say to the critic who would say, well, but we need to change things now. How can we adapt slow resistance, or how can slow resistance really be effective in a time when we need immediate results?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good point. Thank you, Emily, for that. So I think resistance, like violence, typically occurs across different timeframes. And so one of the things that, particularly in this era of digital mobilization, that is so different is the various groups' success in mobilizing vast numbers of people very, very rapidly. This is unprecedented in the history of resistance. What is sometimes harder to tell is what is the structural legacy of that mobilization, and how do you get people to organize in a sustained way, as opposed to simply responding to the instant. And I do think there are examples, and Black Lives Matter is one of them, that where you see longevity and you see flexibility and adaptability, as well as sort of iconic moments. So it's never simply a question of either or. And similarly, I mean, if you think of the slow violence and atomic warfare, you have the immediate killings, and then you have the radioactive legacy. And if you flip that, I think that's also true sometimes of activism, that you have a George Floyd or Eric Garner have this moment that galvanizes people, and then you have the legacy of that, and sometimes it's more successful than other times. But I also wanted to just pick up on your point about visible bodies, and it's very striking around COVID as well how few images we have of COVID deaths. I mean, we hear these stories coming out of care homes and so forth. In New Jersey here, there was a case of, they just found something like 17 bodies dumped outside because they'd run out of space, and they didn't want to damage the brand of the care center, and also obviously legal reasons. But all the swirling pieces of rumor and scientific dishonesty or anti-science, I think they flourish in part, for a number of reasons, but one reason is that it's quite difficult and even ethically challenging to represent somebody in the throes of COVID. Somebody really traumatized by that. We're aware of these 200,000 plus deaths in the US alone, but we're very seldom exposed to those images.
Thank you. I want to pick up on your comment that it's it's very difficult to keep people involved in a sustained way. This got me about I was looking at my notes on your slow violence book, and following Fanon, you mentioned this army of cultural bewilderers, big oil, big coal, where doubt is our product. And kind of fast forwarding that almost 10 years now, in our current political moment, it seems like, sure, we have the money where doubt is our product organizations, but in some ways, it's much more dispersed now, right? So I guess one of the challenges is to think about way of activism in the context where it's not just big organizations that are producing doubt and sort of agnotology. It's all of us. Well, not all of us, but it's a lot of people with such doing rather odd things with conspiracy theories and QAnon and so forth. Mm-hmm. Can we think about ways in which art and activism can move and resist these kinds of trends in our information ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a really challenging one. One of the things that links the COVID crisis and the climate crisis is anti-science. And some of that anti-science swirls around in a kind of a conspiracy force field. And some of it is also well-funded. It's strategic. And so there are people who find themselves swept up, and then there are people who are actively trying to sow confusion and dissent, and to pin the notion of elitism to the notion of science. And so it is a very, very challenging climate in which to operate there. And I think one of the differences between COVID and climate is that climate denialism outside of the US has had a very limited purchase elsewhere. And that's partly, I think, to do with think tanks and the amount of funding from the Koch brothers and others in the US. There's no parallel anywhere else. Whereas I think COVID, there are so many conspiracy theories. They're very variable. The theories around cures, and obviously failures of leadership from the top haven't helped. But countries like, I know a number of African countries that couldn't possibly afford even the basic preventative materials, or have been buying. Some of the leaders have been buying into local medicinal experiments and so forth with no scientific grounding. And so Nigeria was importing a certain tree product from Madagascar recently. You know, we don't know whether it has any efficacy or not. So the desperation, I think, is linked to the proliferation of conspiracy theories, and it is very hard to rein them in.
Thank you so much. I
So
can
maybe,
ask another one, Emily, or I can.
yeah, you carry on. Yeah.
Oh, well, I really was taken very much with the BP images of BP violence, particularly the one with the assassination of the Viet Cong in Vietnam with the gas nozzle.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that this sort of compresses time and everything into sort of, I mean, it's a spectacular image, right?
Yeah.
And then the fracking image of the flame coming out is also a spectacular image. So I guess my comment would be, in some ways, you know, we might understand the slow nature of these violences, but in order to bring them to the consciousness, it almost seems to have to happen in a very spectacular way. Otherwise, we don't pay attention, which is ironic, right? And I started thinking about just other ways that art can sort of promote activism as a way of not of speeding things up and making them spectacular, but of forcing people to, maybe they walk by a piece of art. Your opening image, I think, did that for me, where you slow down and you're like, huh. You know, what my favorite example of that is, and you may know this example better than I do, but it's my understanding, Adrian Parr, Australian scholar, writes that I guess it was in New York or some borough of New York, it was illegal to sleep in the streets, but it was legal to sleep in cars. And so what activists did is they made tents that shaped as cars and put them in parking spots, which would probably get you killed in New York, right? You're taking up a spot. But passerbys apparently from this, you know, art would be like, huh.
Yeah.
And it's that moment of slowing down. So the question has to do, and the comment has to do with speed, spectacle, and pausing to consider and to think.
Right. I think that's a very good question. And you know, so there are two sets of responses. One is compression, trying to compress time, and we saw that with the Anthropocene as well. And the other is to change the instinctive duration of our attention span. And I think at the moment we're in this odd situation where with the rise of the internet over the past quarter of a century or so particularly, you have the kind of rewiring of the brain for greater dispersion and more fractured attention span. At the same time, you have these really long-term issues like climate change and the Anthropocene that are stretching us and saying, you've got to think of 2050 as if it were now, and infuse urgency into that. And so part of it has to do with, I think, the politics of investing in the long term. You know, we've heard a lot about infrastructural investment, Green New Deal, saying, I may not be alive to experience the benefits of these actions, and I certainly won't be in power as a politician, yet it's worth investing in the future and laying down the foundations. And I think in the current climate, because there's so much hostility to regulation, there's so much hostility towards anything that doesn't comport with an extractivist mindset, you know, make a profit and make it now, we have lost some of the values that were associated more with social democrats. So they're trying to balance long-term public good like public health, infrastructure, affordable housing, affordable education, that are less sensational, but actually often much more consequential than maybe more dramatic, immediate interventions.
I think here I might just jump in and offer a question that our colleague from the Japanese program, Yuki Shigeto, asks. She wonders, what are other functions that art can serve besides representational functions to render instantly visible slow violence in helping us to imagine futures radically different from the present?
So yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about what are called speculative nonfiction or anticipatory documentary. And 2050 is very often the target year, partly because that's the IPCC report, the target year of the Paris Accord and those reports. And a lot of nonfiction writers and documentary writers have set events in 2050. We saw that with the Maldives, the underwater cabinet meeting. And writer after writer is producing work that's journalistic in impulse, but anticipatory, which seems like a contradiction. But basically, it's an attempt through the artistry of nonfiction or documentary film to give a plausible reality to 2030, 2040, 2050. So there was a book recently on, trying to remember the name of the writer, I can't remember at the moment, but it's on rising waters. And he was very emphatic that it's journalistic. It's not speculative fiction. And the book starts in 2037 in Miami in a particular Art Deco hotel. And he describes all the fittings and the rising waters and that. And it's written in the present. And he said, I'm not writing fiction, I'm writing nonfiction. So in answer to this question, which is, I think, really resonant one, that's one way that I see documentarians and nonfiction writers responding. Is they're saying, we're not going to say what if, we're going to say, this could happen. So the emphasis in that kind of art is less on possible futures than on plausible futures, trying to translate scientific modeling into narrative and image. Maybe I could pick up on an earlier question that David Johnston asked. The idea of slow violence seems interesting and important, but of course, Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling, and others have written about slow progress, how transformational it is, how positive its effects are in many spheres of life, and how the world is getting better in many ways, and how humans and media tend not to notice or appreciate it. Do you think slow progress relates to concerns about slow violence? Yes, I think that's a really good question. And so if we think of the rising life expectancy of humans over the last couple of hundred years, it's been an extraordinary ascent. At the same time, particularly since the late 70s with the rise of neoliberalism, you have in almost every society rising inequality. So for instance, in New York, I think there are 120 billionaires and 18% of children live in poverty. Okay, so you have this progress, but it's not being very well distributed under the current system. And there have been eras, and there are clearly societies where that progress is not antithetical to the distribution of life chances. The other thing is I would say about the Pinker book is that for those of you who know it, the better angels of our nature, he's saying that particularly with regard to the 20th century, we became so preoccupied with the Holocaust, with genocide, with atomic warfare, with a seemingly endless roll call of wars, starting with the Great War, and then you've got the Second World War, the Vietnam War, and so many others, that we tend to think of it perhaps instinctively as a catastrophic century. And what he was arguing was that actually, despite all of those things, life was better in the 20th century than it was any time earlier. So I would say two things about his argument. One is that he brackets out slow violence. So with the rise in progress and the rise in life expectations, we also have a proliferation of technologies that make it easier for people to be killed 10, 20, 15 years down the line. We have landmines, we have toxic drift, we have DDT, we have atomic weaponry, and we have long distance armaments. So my instinctive sense is that his approximate account of death tolls in pre-industrial times are more, those seem more dramatic because people were sparing each other and so forth. But if you're able to kill people at great distances in space and time, you're likely to get an undercount of the violence in the 20th century, which is my sense of that book. I mean, I think there's a lot to recommend that book, but I did have some reservations, both about the question of equality, inequality, and the question of technology.
I want to be sure that we get to a question that just popped up from an anonymous attendee asking a question about gentrification in the future. The person writes, anthropologists are predicting large migrations of higher income populations from coastal communities as waters continue to rise. We have already seen large migrations due to the impact of wildfires and flooding. Are activists in any way focused on the threat of gentrification on BIPOC communities due to climate change? And I think before I hand this over to Rob, I'll say that one example that might be useful to look at is what's happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, where we saw wide swaths of the city that used to be primarily occupied by people of color, where also there was, and other areas where there were high percentages of low-income housing that had been converted into very lucrative new residential developments. Mm-hmm. While some people might not necessarily immediately categorize that as, part of the climate change emergency, I think it's pretty clear that Katrina was only Katrina because of climate change and the geography of that place. Mm-hmm. So that might be a relatively recent historical example to look to and to see how activists have been responding to that. But Rob and Phil, do you two have any responses to this as well?
Yeah, I would say I think that's a very, very important question, and because my focus has been on rising inequality, what's the place of inequality, and how is the environmentalism of the poor often different from the environmentalism of the well-off? I think. Naomi Klein has written about disaster capitalism, and others have as well, that whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane, the people who brought in to so-called redevelop an area often are not connected to the historic community that's been displaced or traumatized by that event. And so what you have often is people priced out of an area, or it's not made a priority that those people return to that area, and that those schools and churches and hospitals and so forth are rebuilt. Another aspect of that, and I think this question of gentrification is going to become, so-called climate gentrification, is going to become more and more to the forefront, is something that people have talked about in terms of the so-called revival of urban areas under the banner of just green enough. So what happens is that very often, as we've seen historically in cities, artists have moved into abandoned industrial areas, which are often adjoining minority communities, and have become the sort of leading edge of gentrification. And similarly, the greening of parks and cities can sometimes be conjoined to gentrification. In other words, I was thinking of an essay that I was reading in the New York Times a while back of two young 12-year-old African-American boys who were, they joined a protest against gentrification in Harlem. And one of the boys said to the other boy, I told you that those trees they were putting up in our street, they couldn't be for us. And so his assumption at the age of 12 was the planting of trees was suspect. Now, obviously, a planting of trees can be a good thing. It can reduce asthma and so forth. But they realized that that was a marker of gentrification. And so how do you find a balance between actually improving the public spaces, but doing so in such a way that it's not instrumental in accelerating gentrification and displacement?
We've reached close to the end of the hour. We can go a little longer, but I want to make sure that we circle back to Black Lives Matter movement and also in thinking about art and monuments, right? That's a very important part, and reconceptualizing monuments. I'm thinking about the evening projection of the image of Breonna Taylor on the Confederate monument, and then the top, the letters BLM, just below the heroic depiction of some Confederate warrior. I don't know if it was Robert E. Lee. I can't remember. I just tried to Google search the image. I didn't find it, but are you aware of what I'm talking about?
Yes, yes.
It's a really remarkable thing. And in some ways, to me, it mirrors your idea of slow violence in the sense that there's this friction, right? Slow and violence, they don't really go together, right? And then this dramatic juxtapositioning of Breonna Taylor onto the Confederate monument. Are there ways that we can learn from this to reconceptualize monuments? I noticed that the Mellon Foundation is going to be devoting hundreds of millions of dollars to reconceptualizing monuments. And so there's clearly many opportunities here. I'm wondering if you might comment on that.
Yeah, actually, I think the example you give is a very powerful one. And there was another that comes to mind in the city of Bristol in England, in the west of England, which was a big slave trading city. So enslaved people were, the economy of the city was built on slavery, and it was a major enslavement hub. And they found the person who was seen as the founder of modern Bristol made his money in slavery. And there was a statue of him in the main park in the city. And so that was pulled down by activists, and they rolled this very, very heavy statue to the river and dumped it in the river. And there was an African-American, black British woman who jumped up on the plinth and raised her hand in a Black Power salute. And a sculptor saw this, and he later approached her and made a statue of her standing on that plinth. And they got a team and they assembled it in the dead of night, like 3 a.m, and they put this up on the now empty plinth. And the city, of course, insisted they take it down, but they then found another home for it. And so that was a very quick response to this question of the monument. And the activist had simply responded spontaneously, but then the sculptor decided, collaborating with her, to memorialize that moment.
Thank you. We have one more question. It's from our colleague, Oscar Sarin. Actually, Emily, would you mind reading that? I have a hard time seeing it. It's a very small print. Would you mind?
Be happy to. Yeah, I wanted to be sure that we got a chance to hear this question as well. It's a really interesting one. This goes back a bit to the question of temporality and thinking about futurity. Jasper Puar proposes the concept of prehensive time to grasp the future pasts of settler colonialism, in which it is not only that terms of futurity are already dictated in the present, but the terms of the present are dictated through the containment of the terms of the future, in an effort to keep the present in line with one version of the future that is desired. Can we think of slow resistance as making our present here and now in the version of the future that we desire?
Yeah, I think that's well put, especially that last sentence. I think one of the, if you had a longish teaching career, one of the things that you realize is that say for instance, I lived through the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and I left as a political exile. Then I lived in New York through the AIDS crisis and ACT UP and the Reagan era's, demonization of people living with HIV. And there are all these social movements, and then you have the Marriage Equality Act, and things that you thought, well, this is kind of cast in stone, whether it's apartheid or the hostility to marriage equality, and yet they shift. And so one of the things that I feel is that we have a repertoire of things that have changed in the past, and we need to remind ourselves that the majority of people believe that would never change, and yet that change was initiated by activists and organizers and artists and others. And I think the question is exactly right, that part of our challenge is how to resist a confined set of possible futures. And we see this happening with the creation of false binaries like jobs versus the environment, or those sort of things, so that we're encouraged to think in these narrow pre-existing channels. And actually the possible futures, if we really study other societies, other communities, other cosmologies, and other historical examples, there's a lot to draw on. And I think it's one of the anomalies of the American electoral system, is that it seems to be very, very hard to allude to something good that's happened elsewhere without compromising or seeming to compromise your patriotism. And there's such a vast array of practices that have been constructed in so many societies that I think, and I'll end at a positive note, which is to say that I think some of these city-to-city alliances that we're seeing across the world, where the mayors are sharing progressive ideas and transformative futures, are some of the most encouraging signs that I see for the effort to embody future desires that are not constrained by the narrow parameters that we are accustomed to hearing or from our politicians.
Well, in 2020, it seems appropriate to end on a positive note because there aren't many of them, but we appreciate that, and our time is run, and we appreciate the audience attending. And if you know someone that might be interested in the presentation is recorded. It's available on the Whitman Cloud, so you might pass this on. And thank you again, Rob, for your generous time and your energy. And thank you, Emily, for agreeing to this task. And I'd also want to thank Shampa Biswas and the Department of Politics, who first suggested this idea, and to all those who organized the Race, Violence, and Health series, which is ongoing throughout this year. So I bid you all well. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.